Right. We know that cells are made up of mostly water. Well, what about the rest of the cell? What is that made of? Well, it's made up of organic molecules, which are molecules based around carbon. And carbon is unique because it can make 4 bonds. And that's important because it's more than most elements can make. So carbon is a very versatile element, and it makes up the central element in all of these molecules. So that's important to know. All right, now we're going to go over 4 of these organic molecules. They all have carbon, they all have hydrogen, they all have oxygen to some extent. Okay. And so what we want to know is for each molecule, right, what is it composed of? So we'll do the composition. We'll see if it has any monomers. Monomers are these little units that repeat over and over again to build that larger molecule known as a polymer. And then we'll take a look at the structure, what it might look like, as well as take a look at some of the functions. All right, the first molecule we'll look at are lipids. Lipids, as all organic molecules have carbon and hydrogen. They have very few oxygens, which makes them non-polar. They're known for their ability to repel water because water is polar and lipids generally are non-polar. So that's a word you want to associate with lipids. Now lipids technically don't have monomers, and the other 3 we'll look at do have monomers. Right? So in other words, you can't take a you don't take a smaller lipid and connect it to another small lipid and get a larger lipid. They're just their own individual molecules. The most common structure you're likely to see are these fats and oils, which have a glycerol head. So if there is a polar side to it, it's often the head that is polar, because that's where the oxygen is. If there are oxygens, there usually are a few, but it's the tails that are very, very known to be non-polar, and they're known as the fatty acid tails. All right, so just to connect this drawing with a more technical drawing. Okay, so like this is, you can see that's not, even this is a simplified drawing, but when we draw the head and the 3 tails, or the 2, sometimes some of them have 2 tails, this is what we're trying to draw. Notice the tails are almost entirely, in this case, they're all carbon and hydrogen, and the head is where you would find some of this oxygen, and that might be the side, that would be the side that would be polar if it did have a charge. So we want you to see an image like this and recognize that it's a lipid. Right, so if you were to see an image like this, or even a partial image I've seen, on a test where they show you just like this part, and like students are supposed to expect it to know, well, that's a lipid, because it's all you see are carbon and hydrogens. Now, none of these other organic molecules have that feature, so that's how you want to differentiate. Here's another one. Right. The tails are almost entirely carbon and hydrogen, and if you do have a few oxygens, they're generally found on the head side. So that's what we're drawing when we're doing this, when we're drawing these head and tail structures. Right. Obviously, we don't have time to draw every atom. So, right, the general functions of fats and oils is to store energy. Right, so fats and oils store a lot of energy, 9 calories per gram, which is more than carbohydrates. So they store energy. They also repel water. All right. And there are other functions, but these are probably the 2 most common ones you're likely to be expected to know. All right, so our next one, let's take a look at our carbohydrates. Now take a look at the name, and you'll see that there is the word hydrates. Right? And what do you think hydrate means? What molecule do you think that refers to? Right, well, that refers to water, H2O. Right? And carbo is just carbon. So what carbohydrates are, they're just molecules with carbons attached to water. So we want you to know the composition of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, as are all of these, but they're the only molecules that have a unique ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. Let's think of carbon and H2O, if that helps. So in other words, though, in a carbohydrate, generally you'll have twice as many hydrogen atoms as you do oxygen atoms, and you'll have twice as many hydrogen atoms as you do carbon atoms, and so on. All right. Now, carbohydrates do have monomers. They look like this. All right, they're ring-shaped. They'll often have 6 sides or 5 sides to it, and they'll connect to other monomers. They'll even branch out, and they can get pretty complex. But we want you to know that the monomer, the unit that repeats, is known as a monosaccharide. Right? Mono meaning one, and saccharide meaning sugar. So sugars are carbohydrates. Right? The most common, by far, monosaccharide is glucose. In other words, it's one unit. It's a one ring-shaped unit in glucose. And there are other monosaccharides, but glucose is by far the most common one you'll see in our class. All right. So the function, the most common function is that carbohydrates are sources of energy. Specifically sugars, like glucose, fructose, and even some of your larger carbohydrates like starch and glycogen. These are all in our presentation, but they're sources of energy. There's one that I'm going to put up here that is not a source of energy, cellulose. Is a carbohydrate made by plants that is used in making their cell walls. So that's a common one you might want to add to your list. All right. Notice that commonly carbohydrates do end in, their names end in OSC. Not all of them, like starch. Starch doesn't end in OSC, but when you see a word that ends in OSC, it is a carbohydrate. All right, so let's take a look at what some of these might look like in a little more detailed. All right, so here you have, here's glucose, a monosaccharide, and notice you have one carbon connected to an H2O, another carbon connected to an H2O, and so every carbon here is connected to an H2O, so it's a carbohydrate. Now these monosaccharides can connect and link up and form disaccharides. So like sucrose is a disaccharide. It's made up of 2 monosaccharides. And these will commonly link up into much larger carbohydrates. Glycogen is an example found in animal cells, and starch is another example found in plant cells. And so these little units will connect and build more complex. So this is your carbohydrate, and each of these are your monosaccharide monomers. Right. So our next one we'll do is our proteins. Now proteins are composed of the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then we're going to add in nitrogen to it as well. Proteins have monomers as well. They're known as amino acids. Amino acids have this general shape. Okay, let me show you a little more accurate of what it might look like. So here's an amino acid, and there are like 20 versions of these, and what they'll do is they'll link up and form the larger protein molecule, right? So again, this is a monomer. It's a unit of a larger molecule that repeats. So notice, this is a little more detailed. You'll have this one side called the amino group that has the nitrogen, and the other side that is known as a carboxyl group, right, that has the oxygen. Okay, and there are like 20 versions of these. Okay, so that's what I'm drawing here, just simplified, clearly. Right, so these will link up with other amino acids, which will link up with other amino acids and so on. So they'll like link up to form the protein. But this here, one single unit is the amino acid. All right. So the function, now proteins do so many things. They have more functions than all the other three organic molecules, and we're going to get into them bit by bit throughout the course. But the one thing they do not do, so I'm going to, let me list a couple things that proteins are used for. All right, so their functions, like the job, they're involved in transport. So transport is moving things in and out of the cell. We'll get to that in Unit 4. They're used to build cellular structures. All right, like the actual structure of the cell, a lot of it is made up of proteins. There's a whole class of proteins known as enzymes, which we'll get to later on in this unit. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions, but most of them are proteins. And there's really so many things that proteins do. They are the most diverse group of organic molecules. I'm going to put this here in red because it's the one thing you should never say, at least in our class. Proteins do not provide energy. I'm not sure why, but it's a very common thing for students to say, and it's always going to result in the wrong answer. Right? So proteins do not provide energy. They're not a source. They're not a source of energy. Put that in red. Don't ever say that in our class. Although later on in a higher course, you'll find out that that's not necessarily true. All right, and our final molecule we'll cover are the nucleic acids. Right, so nucleic acids, as all the other ones, have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. They also have nitrogen, and they also have in addition to all that, they also have a phosphorus group. So the only two nucleic acids you'll see in our class are DNA and RNA. So notice the N and the A in DNA and RNA, they refer to nucleic acids. So deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. There's actually another nucleic acid that we'll be learning about known as ATP, but when we're talking about this topic, it's almost always referring to these molecules, DNA and RNA. All right, so DNA and RNA are made up of, nucleic acids are made up of monomers, and the way we would draw that is a circle with a P, that's your phosphate group, your phosphorus, and then you have a 5-sided sugar, that's called your ribose, and then you have another group that has nitrogen in it. So again, these are all simplified. Let me show you what a more technical image would look like. Okay. All right, so there is a nucleotide, or a monomer of a nucleic acid. All right, so this is known as a nucleotide. In other words, the monomers of nucleic acids. So notice the first 5 letters, NUCLE, are the same 5 letters of the polymer, or the larger organic molecule. So this might help, because oftentimes we'll ask you, what is the monomer of DNA? Or what is the monomer of a nucleic acid? And you would have to pick out that it is a nucleotide. All right, so I'm going to draw a few more of these. Just draw one more. And now these are connected to each other, not from the phosphate to the phosphate, but rather the ribose, or the sugar to the phosphate, to the phosphate, and this will eventually end up being one of the strands that make up DNA. DNA has 2 strands of nucleotides, and then RNA has 1 strand. We'll get into that more later in Unit 5. Okay, so the function, the primary job of DNA and RNA are to store and decode genetic information. So what that information contains is information to make proteins. Okay, so we learned earlier in Unit 1, all cells have DNA or some kind of genetic information, and all cells have ribosomes, and that's where the proteins are made. So DNA doesn't make proteins, but it has the information to make proteins, specifically the ribosomes. All right, but we'll get to that more in Unit 5.